The Edge of the Mind, From the Soul to the Lab. Psychology Science, second episode. What if someone told you that the human soul could be timed, not described, not debated, timed? Would you believe them? Over 140 years ago, in a small laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, one man actually tried. He sat people down at a table, gave them a signal, a flash of light, a sound, a tap, and measured exactly how long it took them to notice it and respond. We're talking fractions of a second, thousands even. By today's standards, that sounds almost trivially simple. But at the time, it was nothing short of revolution, because for most of human history, the mind wasn't the kind of thing you studied in a lab. It belonged to temples and theology, to poets and philosophers, to the long, sweeping conversations about the soul, free will, and what happens to us after we die. People had always known they had bodies that got hungry and tired, that aged and eventually gave out. But they also sensed there was something else going on inside, something that thought, remembered, feared, loved, and dreamed, something that could picture light in total darkness, or hear its own voice in silence. So they gave it names: soul, mind, spirit, consciousness. And the more important those words became, the harder they were to pin down. You can measure someone's height, you can weigh them, you can dissect a muscle or watch a heartbeat. But how do you measure someone's grief? How do you weigh a thought? How do you prove that consciousness is even real? For centuries, these were philosophical questions. Thinkers sat with them, turned them inward and asked, who am I? How do I know the world is real? Where do my thoughts come from? Are mind and body even the same thing? The ancient Greeks saw reason as a quality that set humans apart. Religious traditions called the soul a flame from a higher world. And René Descartes in the 17th century cut through the fog with one of the most famous lines of philosophy: I think, therefore I am. As long as you can doubt, you're thinking. And as long as you're thinking, you exist. But that raises a problem. If consciousness is so undeniable, so immediately obvious to the person having it, why is it so impossibly hard to study from the outside? You know when you're in pain. You can't hand that pain to someone else to examine. You know when you're heartbroken, but there's no thermometer for that. Consciousness is the most familiar thing in the world, and somehow also the hardest to prove. Then came the 19th century, and everything started to shift. This was the age of steam engines, microscopes, and the telegraph, of germ theory and the periodic table. An era when people started to believe, for the first time with real confidence, that the universe ran on discoverable rules, not mystery, not magic, mechanisms. The body stopped being just a vessel for soul and started being a system. Nerves like wires, eyes like lenses, ears converting air pressure into sensation. And slowly, dangerously, a question crept in: if sensation can be measured, if nerve signals can be timed, if the gap between stimulus and response can be calculated, then can consciousness itself be brought into the lab? In 1879, Wilhelm Wundt said, yes, at the University of Leipzig. He opened what most historians consider the world's first dedicated psychology laboratory. No altar, no pulpit, no philosopher's armchair. Just instruments, timers, stimulus devices, and trained observers learning to watch their own minds. Wundt wanted to do something genuinely radical. Pull psychology away from philosophy and make it an experimental science. He wasn't asking where the soul came from. He wasn't asking whether it survived death. He was asking, when does a person actually become aware of a sensation? How does attention change what we notice? What's happening in that tiny gap between the world acting on us and us acting back? These seem like small questions, but this is where modern psychology was born. In those slivers of time, those almost imperceptible differences in reaction, those careful reports of inner experience. Because from that moment on, the human mind wasn't just something to think about. It was something to measure. That was the first time the boundary moved. Consciousness stepped off the altar and onto the lab bench. It got instruments. It got data. It got methods that could be tested and repeated. But here's the paradox. To study the mind scientifically, psychology had to take it apart. Fear is too complicated in its full form, so the lab studies started responses. Love is too messy, so the lab studies attachment behaviors. Thought itself is too sprawling, so the lab studies reaction times, memory spans, attention shifts. The human inner life is a forest, and in those early days, experimental science could only measure the tremor of a single leaf. That was still progress. Real progress. Psychology stopped being the exclusive territory of philosophers and became a discipline with its own experiments, journals, methods, and findings. But something was also lost in the translation. A lab can tell you how fast someone pressed a button. It can't always tell you why they still think about someone at 3 a.m. It can track where your attention goes. It can't fully explain how decades of loneliness quietly shape who you become. It can study vision, hearing, memory, reflex. It struggles to capture what it actually feels like to be alive in a particular body, in a particular life. That tension has never gone away. Psychology was born wanting to understand the whole person and built itself by breaking people into measurable parts. After Wundt, the field kept moving. Memory, child development, the unconscious, behavior, personality, social influence, trauma, happiness. Each new chapter redrew the boundary of what the mind could mean. The behaviorists eventually said, forget what inside. Behavior is all we can observe, so behavior is all we should study. Then cognitive psychologists pushed back. The brain is an information processing system. Memory is storage. Attention is a filter. Thinking is computation. And today, the boundary has moved again, further than Wundt could have imagined. We have EEG, eye tracking, fMRI. We can watch which parts of the brain light up when someone is afraid, making a decision, or trying to remember a face. We have smartphones and social platforms logging every scroll, every pause, every tap, building behavioral profiles more detailed than anything a researcher could observe in a lab. We have AI that can read emotional tone in text, mimic conversation, predict preferences, and generate a version of a personality on demand. 140 years after Wundt timed the moment of awareness, algorithms are forecasting what we'll want before we want it. That sounds like progress. Maybe it is, but it also brings the old question back, sharper than ever. When a system can predict your choices, does it understand you? When a machine can mimic your voice, does it have something like consciousness? When your attention, your moods, your desires can all be tracked and modeled, is your inner life still entirely yours? Psychology left the realm of the soul to get rid of mystery. But the further it goes, the stranger things get. We know more than ever about how the brain works. We're no closer to knowing who the I is that's doing the working. We've gotten very good at analyzing behavior. We haven't necessarily gotten better at understanding what it's like to be a person in pain. We can simulate the surface of consciousness with remarkable accuracy. We still have no idea how the lights come on inside. That might be what makes consciousness so extraordinary. It is at once a subject of scientific study and the private world that every single person is living in right now. It can be researched, but it can't be replaced. It can be measured, but it doesn't reduce to the measurements. It shows up in a laboratory data set, and it shows up in the silence of someone sitting alone at midnight with no one around. When Wundt turned on the lights in that Leipzig lab in 1879, he didn't solve the mystery of consciousness, but he changed the question. The mind was no longer just asked, "Are you real?" It was asked, "How do you work? How does a sensation become a feeling? How does attention move? How does memory form? How does desire hide from itself? How does a self get built? All of these questions point toward the same deep puzzle. What does it mean to be a someone? Assembled out of neurons, language, memory, and everything that's ever happened to you. Experiencing the world as you? Maybe the birth of psychology wasn't humanity finally catching the soul. Maybe it was humanity finally admitting two things at once. The mind is too important to leave to myth, and too complex to leave to machines. From the soul to the lab, consciousness lost some of its mystery and gained a different kind. It came down from the heavens and landed in the body. It moved from the philosopher's desk into the scientist's instruments, and then somehow it made its way back to every person who thinks, feels, doubts, and dreams. Because the deepest secret of consciousness might not be whether it can be measured. It might be this: the thing being measured is watching itself being measured, and it's been doing that all along.